Today, I have the pleasure of introducing our special guest, Anna Kruse. Anna Kruse received her Master of Fine Arts at the State University of New York at New Paltz. She completed a post-bac at the Oregon College of Art and Craft before moving to Maine to work at Watershed Center for the Arts, for Ceramic Arts. She obtained her BA with honors in psychology and studio art from the College of Wooster. In 2021, she was awarded the International Sculpture Center's Outstanding Student Achievement Award in Contemporary Sculpture. She was invited to be a resident artist at Township 10 during the summer of 2020 and recently completed a residency at Peninsula College. Anna has shown her work in Ohio, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, Texas, Mississippi, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. This past fall, Anna was our visiting artist and scholar in teaching, artist in residence, and she has stayed on to continue to teach with us this year. Thank you, Anna. Please put your hands together and join me in welcoming Anna Kruse.
Hear me? Yeah. Okay. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to my artist talk. Like Scott said, my name is Anna Kruse, and thank you for the Schneider Museum for having me be a visiting artist last fall. And it's been such a pleasure working in the ceramic studio throughout the year. So I wanted to get started by looking at where I got started at the College of Wooster. In the beginning, I grew up in Ohio, was born to some very young, poor parents, and didn't necessarily have an upbringing that was taking me to museums, that was talking about being an artist, really talking about going to college at all. And it wasn't until I got to high school and took a ceramics class just for fun, as many of my students do, and I fell in love. So I ended up at the College of Wooster because it was a liberal arts education, and I wanted to keep my paths open. And then I took a class in ceramics there, and I realized that I wanted nothing more with the rest of my life than to be an artist, to make work. Unfortunately, my parents were not super keen on me being an artist, so I was like, fine, I'll double major and I'll make work, and then I'll also have this other career outlet. Everyone's happy. Well, I'm really stubborn, and so even though I have this psych degree, I never ended up following a path in counseling or anything like that, but ended up focusing mostly on this exhibition you're seeing here that was pulling from what I was interested in psychology, but really trying to gravitate towards figurative art. I was really interested in being a figurative artist when I was in undergrad. And I had this amazing mentor, Walter Zerko, who, bless his heart, was running sculpture and ceramics at the same time and did his best. But I mostly learned how to build by reading books, by looking at Adrian Arlio's The Figure in Clay, by trial and error, and by blowing up a lot of stuff. And that is how you learn, right? It's failure. It's things not working out and then responding to that. And that's really exciting. And so I ended up with this body of work that at the time I was really proud of. Moving forward, I took a couple years off from school, was trying to make it as a studio potter, decided I did not like it, and it was not for me. I wanted to sculpt. It's always what I wanted to do. So I ended up looking through Julia Galloway's field guide for ceramic artists, which is an amazing resource if you're looking at any sort of post-bac or grad education. She has a very extensive list of schools and what they offer. Anyway, and I ended up at the Oregon College of Art and Craft. Having a BA, I was missing some technical sort of backgrounds, and I knew that going to a craft school would fill in that education for me. And I was hungry to learn. I wanted to learn how to fire every single kiln that school had. I wanted to learn how to build big. I wanted to learn how to slip cast and wheel throw better. And that school with Chanda Z and Dylan Beck was the place to do it. So in a very sort of me move, I packed my car and drove across the country, which was really exciting. And I grew a lot, but I got there and I was still really trapped in figurative art. And I kept making these projects that I wasn't super happy with, that I felt really limited by because I was categorizing myself as one thing. And then Linda Swanson, who's an educator up in Canada, an amazing artist who does a ton of material studies, came as a visiting artist, and she was really responding to these sort of like organic forms I was making, where I was taking small patties of clay and just building them and letting the clay slump and then responding to the process, creating these openings. I was really interested in not necessarily making the figure, but making work about the figure, how to get outside of locking myself into these forms, and instead thinking about what am I interested in terms of psychology, in terms of human nature, and how we're navigating this world through objects. And so I started making, these sort of abstract pieces, and Linda's like, man, these are way more compelling than your figurative work. So I ran with it. And I think that that speaks to the importance of getting mentorship from different people, from listening to your mentors, from asking questions, and also really being self-critical about, am I happy with the work I'm producing and how can I push it further? So during my time at OCAC, I really started to build a little bit bigger, to get away from being locked into the figure. I started working in parts. So you're kind of limited by the kilns sometimes, and OCAC had some really great kilns, but they weren't always as tall as I wanted them to be. So I started trying to, you can see the line sort of in the middle, teaching myself how to construct things modularly, and also making challenges for myself all the time. Like, I want to build something as big as me. Okay, let's do it. I want to fill this kiln. Let's do it. And after the show, I was still meandering, trying to figure it out, trying to think about what it was I actually wanted to be making. So I made these as like a little sort of experiment, and I would end up doing little studio experiments a lot in grad school. Would recommend. Don't always make things for like an end product, make things for the process, for the experience of making it, figuring out what it is your intention is, how you want people to interact with your work. So I made these because I was like, man, I want to work with the figure, but like, what if the figure was like inside? Like, what if it could actually be inside of my work? And while I don't necessarily think that formally these are like the most successful works I've ever made, they ended up leading to a long string of works I would make in grad school. And then someone was like, oh, you should look at James Turrell. So James Turrell is a part of the very loose movement of light and space during the 60s and 70s in California. And he's really interested in these moments of like rest, of perception, of, it's not necessarily how I see the work, it's how you're experiencing the work and seeing the world around you. And I was blown away. It was the first time that someone told me to look outside of the field of ceramics for inspiration, which I think is another great piece of advice I got from mentors, was don't just look at your field. Look at other things that are influential. Look at how other mediums, sculptors, installation artists are going about the things that you're trying to go about, because you'll never know like what you're going to pick up from them, right? So I get into grad school at SUNY New Paltz with Brian Seabez and Anat Shifton, which was the most transformative 2 years of my life. I learned a ton, and it was amazing. And I started doing more of these sorts of experiments where I was really interested in works being completed by the body, works that were about perception and feeling and experience and knowing. So I was making all these like little things and just kind of like tunneling into them or sticking body parts through them and trying to figure out how they could manifest into works that could be shown and installed. And then I also started looking at inspiration, like I said, in other fields. So Franz Walther does a lot of fabric sculptures, but he was also doing these experiments and installations where people were like tethered together through his sculptures. Right? He's really interested in space and how your body kind of activates the work. And so I love this term of like activation, the work becoming kind of like alive, alive through the form and through gesture. So I made my first in a series of wearable works, and playing around a little bit with humor. I hope my breath smells good. So I was like, oh man, you're gonna put this on with someone? Like, hope they brush their teeth. This tube is hollow, and everything in my building process is just coils. I just stack coils and shape them how I want them, and I put clay where I want it, and let the clay kind of, speak to me, tell me what it wants to do. Technically speaking, because this piece is two really heavy pieces tethered by a very thin tube, I fired it on a lot of sand. And ceramic sand is your best friend. When firing, it acts as ball bearing, so pieces can shift and move and roll in the kiln and not drag on those kiln shelves and bust apart. The piece actually wasn't that heavy, but I think the magic of it is how distorted your senses get, and I became really interested in sort of sensory deprivation at this point, and how tethered you are to that other person. So you can't see them, you can only kind of hear them, and it's reverberating kind of strangely through this device, and you can feel every single movement, like you become this sort of creature with the other person, and it's this like intimacy through this object that I was really compelled by. And then the question, the very important question that you should always be asking yourself when you're making objects is, where does it live, right? And it's not always going to be a white pedestal. Sometimes you've got to build special things for it. So this like sort of sawhorse contraption pedestal, I thought I really loved the tension of weight, the sort of tension of almost breaking, and the sort of nod toward seesaws on playgrounds. Because playground equipment is going to start popping up here, because I started getting really interested in that. So fast forward to COVID, school shuts down, but I had the pleasure of being invited to Township 10 by Marjorie Dial, which is in North Carolina, and it's a small residency in the middle of freaking nowhere. And it's the most beautiful place, bountiful, green, lush, middle of July. I was real sad because I hadn't touched clay in a while, and then I got to go here, and I started just being outside and making work. And that was all I did for like almost a month, was make work for like 10 hours a day. And it was phenomenal. Always do a residency if you can. And I started being really inspired by the surroundings there. And then thinking back to, I hope my breath smells good, I was like, okay, well, what other senses can I capitalize on? Sound. Because this physical space is one aspect of how we take up space, how we command a room. Sound is another aspect, right? My voice is carrying throughout. And so I started thinking, okay, how can I make a piece that is activated by my body and movements, but is going beyond my physical self in terms of presence and experience? So I made this piece, and as I moved more aggressively in a series of performances I did, the louder the piece would get, the more sort of strange it would sound. This is a heavily reduced clay body, so it has a sort of metallic sound to it, so it's very high-pitched. And I, just kind of kept exploring this and trying to look for other artists that were exploring similar themes, which leads me to Rebecca Horn, another super influential artist. I love her work. She was really interested in the connection between body and space and body extension. For those of you in my experimental class, you're already probably pretty familiar with her. She was hospitalized in a sanatorium for quite some time because of exposure to fiberglass. And when she came out, she was really started doing all of these different experiments with her body and the form and the amount of space she was taking up. And I thought that her experiments were just compelling and breathtaking. And she continues to be a huge influence in my work. So I kept moving forward with this series, thinking through sort of other senses that I could kind of capitalize on. And the last one, I'm Calling to You, the one with the sound, was so loud and so expansive, and I wanted something that did the opposite. So I started thinking about how we listen, how we internalize our environment, the internal world within us. And so I wanted to make a piece that was kind of a moment to pause, to listen, something that maybe, we're all trying to work on and being better is how to listen well, to not always rely on sight and the other senses that kind of dominate our daily life. So this is clearing the wax, again, kind of playing around with humor. So clearing your wax. And then taking photographs of environments where I could insert the piece into the landscape. I took a lot of images and videos of ditchweed, which is really kind of everywhere in New York, grows like freaking bamboo on the side of the road, kind of inserting itself into this piece. Lots of sitting and listening. It would kind of distort noise in a really interesting way. Started getting really interested in sound. And then sort of the last one in this series so far is appendage. This one was like a quicker study. Actually, this one kind of, it came right after I Hope My Breath Smells Good. I made it at the residency. And I wanted something that could be, I used it as like a horn or as a listening device. So it had multiple facets. But I love this idea of like cones coming together and amplification. I was looking at like old equipment from World War I and World War II where they were doing like listening for airplanes, right? How to amplify sound. Little studies. I don't really make maquettes. This is kind of my version of a maquette. But it led to this piece, which is my biggest piece. I made the challenge of filling the biggest kiln at my grad school. I ended up doing that challenge a few times, which was super fun and maybe really irritating for my cohort because they always had to help me. Feel like, get you a treat afterwards. And this is the one that won the International Sculpture Award. So this is when I started really looking at activating work and then the spaces in which I felt most activated, whether as an adult or as a child. And that was playgrounds, right? Like the place where things are freaking feral. You're like throwing yourself over objects. You're interacting with others. You're like speaking through those talk tubes. Do those still exist? You know what I'm talking about, right? So that's this, just smashed together and ginormous. And I really wanted this void you could fall into, right? I was always interested in keeping this like sense of like tension and danger and the unknown within the work. So it's some of my advisors in grad school called my work existential playgrounds, kind of like that. So it amplified sound really well. It's all hollow. It's all coil built. I built it in a different direction than you're seeing it. And I really like sitting on my work. I think it's fun, It's a little jungle gym, building for myself slowly. So firing it on that big frame, the biggest bell that then supported and came together. So it was really strong. And like the slowest firing I think I've ever done in my life because I was freaking terrified of this thing blowing up. And then two parts. So that base has a big flange system in it, so that top piece would rest on the base. And miraculously, against all odds, it stood up. I remember putting this thing together in the clay, making this awful screeching noise. But I ended up being really, really happy with it. Sad story though, a child tried to climb inside of it. Child was fine. Piece is now in multiple pieces. So kind of a nice compliment, right? Like they thought it was playground equipment, so I wasn't mad. Asked if the kid was okay. He was totally fine. So anyway, yeah. Then I started thinking more of oh wow, these places I occupied as a child. So I grew up as an only child, and I didn't grow up with video games. It was either go outside or read. It's my options. And I was like, okay, activation of spaces. How else are bodies activated? Furniture, right? The way that we're interacting with objects in a physical sense can be determined by the shape of the object that we're interacting with. And so I was like, okay, well, I don't really want to make a chair. What did I used to interact with as furniture as a child? My dog, right? So I ended up making a dog chair. It's called Thanks for the Syrup because it's based on a story where my dog, he was a boxer named Casper, And as a child, I was a huge sugar fiend. And my mother would always hide all the sugar up on like the top cabinet. And I trained my dog to sit in front of the cabinet so I could climb up on him and get a cookie for him, cookie for me. Well, that day we were out of cookies, and I instead dumped syrup everywhere. Don't do that. So I started making some furniture, and this is kind of what came out of it. Again, just coil built, and then heavy iron clay reduction fired with a little bit of wash on it. So in person, it's kind of almost satiny, you know? Really, really nice, sort of buttery surface. I wasn't really using glaze or color up until this point. I don't know if anyone noticed that. Everything was brown. And then my advisor was like, why is everything brown? So I made this piece. I would not, I sledgehammered these later. They were a great jumping off point. They were a combination of, you know, flowers and gardens, things that I loved as a child and love today. Furniture, something that could walk off on its own. It was all hollow, so you could talk through it, and like it was almost like a sound piece. But there was something about it that I just was not happy with. But then, from that, I made this piece, which I am happy with. And I think that's something important as makers, right? Like, not everything's going to be a success. And that is okay. That is okay. Because you learn so much from those pieces that maybe don't make it out of your studio. So this piece, an ascending close, would be the sort of jumping off point of my thesis in grad school. I started thinking more of specific imagery and flowers that were growing in my garden growing up. Well, not my garden, but you know, my mom's garden. I was too little to plant things. And I loved grape hyacinths, because I felt like they were containing secrets, like all those little pods. Like I kind of felt like I could burst them open. They'd start like whispering to me or something. I was a weird kid. And then I was trying to root it back to the things that were really propelling my practice, phenomenology, psychology, the way we're interacting with each other, perception, light, sound, space, right? Work that's activated by the body. So it's like all coming together for my senior show, or not my senior show, but my grad show. So this is a piece that was built as a hollow tube, and then pods were slowly added to it. As it was, you know, coming up, the pods start closing up. And I was kind of thinking in like this way of growth as becoming an adult, of filtering ourselves, of closing ourselves off. The harder it is to have relationships, the harder it is to find friends. So rooting it back into the sort of the psychology of things, right? How difficult it is sometimes to be a human. And this blue that is subdued and grows more intense as the piece gains verticality. And then my studio mate at the time, which I think, again, cohorts are so important. You learn so much from your friends and your fellow peers, gave me a book on Bosch, and my mind was freaking blown. I love the series. The Garden of Earthly Delights is a triptych, oak, wooden panel, oil paint, folds up, outside is dark, inside is this colorful, magical world, right? And I loved the forms. I was already building the next couple pieces I'm going to show you, and he was kind of astounded that I had never looked at this piece in particular, because the piece in question that I was working on was this one. And I started to gain imagery from painters, which also I wasn't doing. And all of a sudden, my sort of like visual dialogue, my visual kind of like my capstone students, I'm telling them to make a living document of all the things that influence them, right? And then all of a sudden, my living document blew up, and it got huge, and it was phenomenal. And I had so many different resources to look at because someone handed me a book, and that, you know, it was someone that knew my practice well because we were studio mates. This piece, again, it's coil built, it's all hollow. Actually got yelled at the beginning of my show because I was showing someone how it makes sound, because you can like kind of hit the openings and it would make a different tone. And the guy that runs the museum was like, don't touch the artwork. And I was like, it's mine. Oops. And then this bulb is hiding something. So I started playing around with sort of revealing and concealing The grape hyacinth piece, which my advisor Brian called the blueberry, it was interesting that it let light through and you could see through it, but it didn't necessarily hide anything. And I wanted more secrets. And so this one, you'd walk up and there's a perforation at the top, light would come in, and there's this spiky, sort of aggressive piece inside of that big bulb at the top. So I wanted people to feel a sense of intimacy with the works, where they were kind of forced to come up close. I made this as a sort of sister piece to it, something a little bit more like grotesque and aggressive, but on the outside, bringing those spikes to the forefront, thinking through a lot of gesture with these. I wanted there to be a lot of motion, like they're all bending back and something's about to like spurt from the top of this. I do want to make a fountain in case anyone's curious. And then kind of holding on to playground equipment, and I made this piece, the last one in the series, kind of going back to playground and tubes and talking through objects. This is hollow, and you can speak into the petal cups, and it bounces the sound around. And so I got a lot of fun videos of people like playing on it and children sitting in the middle of it. And I love that. I love the pieces being activated and having the sense of play and playfulness in the work, even though it's kind of rooted in some serious things, some dark things, some things from my past, right? But bringing it into a context that's accessible, that allows it to be something else. So there's, it's an onion. And then this kind of act of the two pieces nestling against each other, passing each other, thinking a lot about love, two lovers coming together, creating this kind of complete picture. And this is an install shot of everything with some other grad work. And then the title of the show, Ownerism, is a term in psychiatry that's an awake state that is dreamlike or hallucinatory. So I wanted things to have this sort of layer of otherworldly. Moving forward, this is a sort of a one-off piece. And I like showing this one because it's like super weird in terms of like what I was already making. It's very, very different. We were prompted for a design, object, and image class to make something that tethered between object and image. And I started thinking about all the piles of random crap that I had. It's not crap, I mean, it's all gonna be used at some point, right? In my studio, and secondary objects, right? Like things that we look past all the time. And so this is like a broken bit, shrink slabs for bigger works that typically would have been discarded. Drywall that lives under the sculpture so that they can move and not crack in the kiln. Pallets, I used to always build my big pieces on pallets for the pallet jack, make my life a little easier, not break my back so much. I sit on cinder blocks to sculpt in the studio a lot of times, and I don't even know how many freaking rolls of plastic I have at this point. So how can that all come together to make an image of process in studio practice? And I made this in like a weird 20-minute frenzy, and I think that it's like a really great piece to remind me that the castaways are just as important and can kind of culminate in something really interesting. To look at your process, to look at the things you're disregarding, throwing out, and thinking to yourself, well, maybe do they have significance in some way? Could they be a piece in and of themselves? So sadly, I finished grad school, which was an amazing 2 years, despite COVID's very strong attempt to thwart it. And I knew I wanted to keep making. I also knew I wanted to teach in some capacity. Throughout my time, even during undergrad, I was a TA every single chance I got. I was teaching intro classes to undergraduate students in grad school. I loved teaching as much as I loved making. So I looked for residencies that had teaching opportunities that also gave me studio space and a stipend. That's the kicker. And I ended up at Peninsula College, which is on the Olympic Peninsula. I'd wake up and look at Canada every morning. It was breathtaking. person from Ohio has been like seeing these amazing parts of the country, and I feel profoundly fortunate for that. So I started working on a solo exhibition that would later be titled Surface Tension. And I started thinking back on grad work, and I love making big work. If I could make all my sculptures 15 feet tall, I would. However, I was working 3 jobs. My space was smaller. I didn't have the resources I had in grad school, which is my take advantage of it while you can. So my work changed. It was smaller. It was things I could get done in a matter of a week or 2 versus months. And I started thinking of, I'd been through this kind of really tough relationship with someone in my life for years. And thinking about the tension of that and the like desire for it to work, the desire for love and intimacy, it not working out, for it to become this sort of prickly, aggressive thing that if you let it could ruin you. So I started making a lot of work that was like pieces coming together, consuming one another, reaching out and almost touching one another. And so the works for the solo exhibition, 2 were a time for me to explore surfaces. Nothing had been glossy yet. I mean, jumping to color was huge. Glossy, no one had seen it. I remember my friends being like, "Who are you?" But I love this glaze because it made the thing look alive. Like it was like slimy and like sliding down the wall. And I also started making wall work. The exhibition space I had was a hallway, basically. I mean, it was a gallery, but it was really long and awkward. So that's kind of another thing, right? You're always responding to the space you're showing in. So I wanted something that was sort of amorphous and then these like little tendrils coming out and almost completing the picture, but not quite. This tension, which leads me to this next point where they are touching, but one is sort of consuming the other, being swallowed. A really dry sort of glaze on this, super high manganese, still coil building. And my surfaces, these like little ripples you're seeing are just remnants of making. The way I coil, I don't stack my coils. I coil like little sandwiches that I pinch up. And so all those little marks are just my pinch marks. And I really like leaving that sort of process of making because it's so incremental. And then there's this piece, starting to work with weight. Thinking about baggage, thinking about the sounds of baggage, which sounds, I don't know, I just was like, if you were always like carrying around the things that make you who you are, what would they sound like? And so I started pulling these rods of clay, like you would make a handle, but really, really long, and then over firing them. So there's kind of this screeching metallic sound when they clink together. And then this piece notches onto the wall, so it just had holes in the back of it. And hooks were built into the end points, and then wire and string to hang the rest of it. And then this piece, to gaze upon the other, thinking of emerging from cocoons, coming out and like sniffing one another and like figuring out, well, do we want to become a whole organism or do we want to stay separate? Thinking about glaze and color placement, shiny versus matte, right? And that played a pretty big part in this piece, where the 2 ends that are almost touching were like kind of a bloody color and very, very glistening and reflective, super, super high melt. The rest of the work is much more matte and more subdued. I wanted the focal point to be in the tension of the space between the parts. It's like not even about the piece at that point. It's just about that space. Everything I do build has a lot of volume. It's always double walled because I think that that's stronger to catch air and have that volume than just a slab of clay. And then I wanted to create the sense of like extreme depth in this piece. Like these things are really kind of like living in their own kind of pods. So really pushing that inner wall back. And then I started thinking about my grad show and aspects of my bigger pieces that I was really drawn to. The act of repetition and gesture and patterning and shadow and perception, kind of playing with the eye. And I started making these pieces. which are a series of very small hand-rolled spikes placed incrementally in a very large disc. They're attached to the wall, and they're quite deep, so you could kind of stick your head in them. I don't know if you'd want to, but I wanted this sense of being like sucked in to like this void, like it was something that could eat you. And so I started, playing around with patterning. I'll say they were amazing, and I like loved making them, but they really pushed me. Just the like, ding, ding, ding. I never worked like that before. It was really interesting to not only work off the wall, to start using glazes that were different, but then to work on things that were so tiny and detail oriented. And I think it's really important to mix up your practice like that. I'll return to stuff like this eventually, but I cannot wait to start building really massive things again. And in this series, I ended up making 3 because I think odds are better than evens when it comes to display. Playing around with patterning in the different ways that they kind of make your eye move around or suck you in or push you away. I loved watching people interact with them because it was like they were kind of nervous and didn't totally know how close they could get. And they're kind of precarious too because they're quite large and then just being like notched onto the wall. And then this is my favorite of the 3. I was really pleased with the patterning on this one and just felt that it was quite successful with how evenly spaced everything was and the sort of swirling you'll get if you stare at it long enough. Kind of again playing with perception and sight. So that's sort of the kind of general overview of a lot of my work, and I just kind of wanted to end on this work in progress right now. So excuse the very messy picture. It's a piece I'm hoping to participate in Art Beyond, and a piece that eventually will be more arms coming up in these little pods. My plan is to have people be able to come up and snip pods away from it, so an interactive piece that will kind of disintegrate and change form as it is living. So again, thank you guys so much. Last comment. I have a very special group of students going to a clay art conference in Davis, California in April. We will be having a ceramic sale soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for questions, and we have a cordless mic. We are recording the video, so this mic will allow us to capture your questions. Any questions on this side, and then we'll pass it around. Any questions? Okay, here we go. We'll start down here. Hi, Laurel.
Hi, Laurel.
Hi. Is this working? Okay, so the last couple of pieces, not this one, the ones before that looked like sort of indent and like this one. I'm just curious how you managed to get such symmetry.
I was using like the seamstress ruler.
Okay.
Yeah, like a flexible measuring tool, and I would basically each circle I would measure out and then map out all of the spikes and then hand roll a level. And then I'm not gonna lie, maybe this is too much information. I did rewatch the entire series of Harry Potter while I was making these. I mean, you gotta have some background noise when you're doing something this tedious. So I just measured and mapped, and then I was working on these too when they were leather hard, so a little more set up, so it was easier to kind of get in there and like make sure everything was really clean.
They're fantastic.
Thanks.
All of them, really. I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Laurel. Other questions? Coming up to the back. Okay, here I come. Hi, Jilla.
Thank you. Hello, Anna.
Hi,
Danielle,
Jilla.
is this working? What a wonderful artist talk. One of the things that I was thinking about is how a lot of the concepts or experiences that you're like communicating with your pieces could theoretically be communicated similarly using a different kind of 3D medium. And so I'm curious about what specifically makes you keep coming back to ceramic to express these ideas?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One I got asked a lot in grad school. I love the sensuousness of clay. It is bodily inherently. The way the language around ceramics is very bodily. We always talk about the vessel and containment, which, I mean, what is this? And so I think, the field of ceramics, the way we talk about work, fit within the concepts I was already working in. I love the responsiveness of clay, the malleability of clay. I love the way it feels in my hand. I know that I could probably make these works out of different material and it would be lighter. I wouldn't have to transport them and cross my fingers that everything stays buckled down. But I can't imagine working in anything else. I love ceramics, and I think part of it is when I was growing up, I loved dirt. I still love dirt. I love anything that's primal, that's squishy and can be anything. I think that clay can be anything. And that's what keeps me coming back. Yeah.
I'm curious that I see a lot of your art is depicting these really abstract conceptual ideas about the body and interaction between bodies. And I'm curious how you conceptualize such abstract images to depict that. Do you start by doing more illustrative work and drawing really from life ever in your process, or do you go sort of more into these very abstract ideas of that, if that makes sense?
I think other art professors might hate this answer. I don't sketch, really. I think about gesture, and I think about things in space and how they're interacting in space. My sketches are usually me spending a few seconds sort of sculpting roughly in clay what I want, or thinking through elements that I want to influence the piece. But even for my grad work, which to the dismay of my advisors, I really didn't sketch anything. I do that more now because it's quicker to sketch and get ideas out than I don't have the time I had in grad school to spend days on end with no sleep to make things. But I think first about feeling and gesture the way I want people to interact with it. We're thinking about sort of the interactions I've had with other people, and that fuels the work. Sometimes I'll sketch stuff out if I'm having a really hard time. A lot of my process is build it up, tear it down, build it up again, tear it down a little bit more. It's a back and forth. It's sort of this dance, I guess. And I let things kind of grow organically too. And I think that's another part of why I choose clay, because it can be taken down and brought back up so many different times. That I'm responding to it in space. I'm responding to the materiality of it. And so, am I meandering? I feel did I answer your question? Okay, cool. I think first about intention, then maybe sketch, then I just start making. Yeah.
Hi, your work is phenomenal, by the way. I love it. And I heard you had mentioned that you get inspiration from your mother's garden and those flowers in particular. Are there any other plants that you would say you got inspiration from?
Yeah, I started looking at, especially for this work, I was looking at defense mechanisms of plants, so thorns and spikes, thistle, things that would sting or irritate skin. And so it's not always a fond, oh, I love great hyacinths when I was little. It's what's going to fuel the work best. So yeah. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Hi.
Hi.
Mine's not so much a question, but I just wanted to thank you for such a, it was a really vulnerable yet informative artist talk, and just hearing all about your work. And I just, you've personally changed my life, and I wanted to thank you for, coming here. And your work is amazing, and it was so special to hear more about why you create and all around it. And so thank you so much for, being you. So, all right, I'm going to give it to somebody else before I start crying.
Thanks, Shelby.
Is it
On
okay?
that note, unless there's one more question. Yeah.
Okay. So something that I'm wondering about is that you obviously think about your audience a lot when you're making work.
Mhm.
And hearing this side of it, you're talking a lot about like the big like personal concepts and ideas that you're putting into it, and then how that's kind of driving you to like a conclusion that's an experience for your audience. And I'm curious about how much context, like you've given us today, do you like provide alongside your work?
None of it.
Whoa.
Yeah, and this is like surface level context. There's like stacks and stacks of articles and books and pictures I've looked at. And you can't, I mean, if I explained everything, it would take hours. So I think that's important too, is like how the things are all melting in your brain, living with the work, living with the ideas, understanding the sort of like the life of the work, right? It's like you like birth this thing and you put it out in the world, how's it gonna be received? Is your intention being matched by the way your audience is interacting with it? But I give nothing. You can get a little bit from titles and that's it.